Hey, it's Roger. I'm back, creator of the Azure Sandbox, and this is going to be the final installment of the video series on using the Azure Sandbox to learn more about Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So let's just jump right in there. So I'm just going to go right up to the Azure portal and see what kind of progress we've made in the last few days. So we've been able to drive our secure score up to 73%, which is good. And we've been able to mitigate and remediate all of the recommendations that are in the critical, high, and medium categories. We still have 45 low risk recommendations that we could potentially explore remediating, but that would take a lot of time. And I'll talk at the end a little bit about some of my plans for future builds of the Azure Sandbox that should address some of these things. Um, the estate is the same size. It's always good to check that. Your Azure estate is probably not static, so we still have the same number of resources being monitored here. So, if new resources pop up or old resources go away, that can affect your secure score. So it's always good to check, these numbers to help understand what the impact is on your secure score. So, if we look at our trend here, this is like the fifth or sixth day that we've been tracking this and mitigating various recommendations. You can see our progress was, around 12 points. So we started with foundational cloud security posture management with a secure score of 61%, and we've driven that up 12 points to 73%. A lot of the counts for recommendations we've driven down to 0 for the high and medium risk. For the low risk, we've been as high as 53, and we've driven it down to 45 low risk recommendations. And again, the size of our estate has remained, fairly consistent for the past few days because we haven't been provisioning anything or deprovisioning anything. So let's dive in here and take a look at what kind of stuff changed. So first thing you'll notice is the medium risk the high risk recommendation for Azure SQL database has been remediated. Basically, that's a very easy one to remediate. It was a recommendation that said that you needed to establish a baseline of users who have access to the various databases. And all you really have to do is click on a button that says establish baseline. And that way, if new users get added later, that recommendation will pop up again and ask you either to adjust your baseline or kick the new users out, which is pretty cool. Tracks it all for you. So that was remediated. Let me see. There was another medium risk recommendation associated with a vulnerability in OpenSSL. And I tracked that back to an old build of MySQL Workbench. And all I did was go in and deinstall that, and it marked itself as mitigated. Now, one of the persistent ones that I haven't been able to get to go away is this one on secrets that were detected on JumpWin1. I have gone and deleted those and deinstalled, the associated components that use those secrets. However, it's taken quite some time for this recommendation to be marked as mitigated. So not really sure what's going on there, but we did take action to remediate that particular, change. Now, if you look at, some of these other recommendations, some of them are kind of redundant. Like these 4 are talking about enabling, either Azure Disk Encryption, or, you've also got similar recommendations about encryptions of temp disks, caches, and storage resources. Like a lot of these are very closely related in terms of how you elect to do encryption of your disks. So, those are going to get mitigated in a future build of the Azure Sandbox. I'll look at either moving to Azure Disk Encryption or possibly host encryption and see if we can, drive down and address some of those things and improve our security posture for the sandbox. Um, these are all encryption related as well. So there's literally 3 redundant sets of recommendations that deal with encryption on VMs that we should be able to knock out probably a dozen of these just by simply enabling some type of, more advanced encryption for the disks used in the virtual machines. This particular one, talks about there should be more than one user assigned to subscriptions. So this is just, in case one of your user accounts get compromised, you should have some kind of break glass account so that another user can get in and do administrative work against the subscriptions. So, I'm in a sandbox environment. I'm the only user of it, so that's not going to get changed anytime soon. As far as these recommendations on system updates, um, uh, we enabled automatic guest OS updates on our VMs. That's all orchestrated as part of the patching that happens automatically inside Microsoft Azure. So this is probably looking at settings for things like Windows Update, and that really doesn't apply when you're using platform updates for these things. So I might push back on these and say, hey, I'm already doing this. It's just the way that this recommendation is checking to see if that's happening isn't looking at whether or not you've enabled platform updates. I kind of feel like we already did this one. We did limit the storage firewall. So if you recall, we had 2 medium risk recommendations associated with that. It's now bumped down to low. So it probably just wants me to tighten it down a little bit further. So that is something I'll definitely take a look at in the future. This one for Azure Active Directory being used to authenticate to Azure SQL Database, we would have to set up Microsoft Entra ID Connect and synchronize our local security identities from our domain controller up into Microsoft Entra ID. That's definitely something that we can do to layer on top of the sandbox, and I'll probably do a future video series on how to enable that type of authentication. All 4 of these are about, configuring to periodically check for missing updates. Again, I've enabled platform orchestration, patch orchestration on all of my VMs. So I kind of feel like this has been addressed. It's just these recommendations aren't aware of that particular setting on these VMs. So I would make an argument that we have already addressed this. These 4 here are interesting. These go into the laundry list of the minutia associated with secure configuration of VMs, right? And if you look at hardened VM images that are available from an organization like the Center for Internet Security, they're kind of like have everything locked down by default, and those hardened VM images can be a little bit difficult to use, particularly in a sandbox environment where you're trying to experiment with a lot of features and capabilities. So I'm going to intentionally not deploy hardened VM images because a lot of those features people might need to have enabled for testing in a sandbox environment. But if you did want to mitigate these, one quick and dirty way of doing that is just move to the CIS hardened images when you deploy your virtual machines. Linux VMs should have Azure Disk Encryption. That's another disk encryption one. We talked about these 2 for Key Vault, right? So we had 4 recommendations for Key Vault. We mitigated 2 of them. These two I made a decision not to enable because I want to be able to deprovision the sandbox, and enabling these would leave stuff hanging around after I deprovisioned them. And, it's just not critical data. So I didn't feel that this particular environment was appropriate for either of these two to be enabled, right? The expiration date, I might think about going ahead and adding that to a future release of the sandbox. If you have a time limit on the number of days that you want your sandbox to be available and you just automatically want to expire it, this would be a quick and dirty way of doing that. This guest configuration recommendations, like we're using either Azure Automation desired state configuration or Cloud Init to do configuration management on our VMs. We're not using guest configuration yet. That's something that I may move to in a future release of the sandbox. So these ones I'm going to leave alone. This one would be easy to mitigate. Basically, just set up email notifications for high severity security alerts. That would be a very easy thing to set up. I'm not going to do it, but if it'd be some low hanging fruit for you if you were trying to drive up your secure score. EDR configuration issues should be addressed on virtual machines. So this is looking at how Microsoft Defender for Endpoint is configured on my Linux machine. It looks like, I know we had previously had a recommendation to enable real-time detection, which we had done, and that mitigated one of the medium risk recommendations. But it looks like there's more configuration work we could do here to improve the coverage of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, or Defender for Servers, as we would call it, on that Linux jump box. I'm not going to do that now, but it's, some low-hanging fruit that we could check out later. This recommendation has to do with enabling Azure Active Directory authentication or Microsoft Entra ID authentication for both MySQL Flexible Server and Azure SQL Database. We already talked about how we might do that in the future. And then these are a simple change for a future build of the sandbox. So all 5 of these, I can mitigate these simply by encrypting these Azure automation variables that we use during provisioning. And then this last 2 talk about using adaptive application controls. So really that's like setting a baseline of what software you use on the machines and then detecting changes when new software shows up. And that's a really good one. I've always liked that. But given that the software is fairly static in these particular sandbox environments, and they're there, frankly, to install new software and to test and try out new capabilities, those aren't really something that I'm planning on messing around with right now. So good news is, just by doing some low-hanging fruit remediations, we were able to drive our secure score all the way up from 61% to 73%. I have a look at those real quick so you can see them. So if I go up to GitHub and I go into the Azure Sandbox repo, and you go into the issues here, you will see all kinds of enhancement issues that I've logged for myself to work on to implement and improve the security posture of a baseline Azure Sandbox deployment. So those will be all things that will result in a better secure score for just a default deployment of the Azure Sandbox right out of the box. So you'll see these show up in future releases of the Azure Sandbox. So with that, that's the end of this particular video series. I hope it was educational and helpful for you, and happy hunting out there using the Azure Sandbox to experiment with new features and capabilities in Azure. Thanks, everybody.